The mid-morning sun of the Montana Territory was a hammer, and the dusty thoroughfare of Black Ridge was its anvil. The heat radiated off the parched earth in shimmering, oily waves that distorted the horizon, making the distant, jagged mesas appear as if they were melting into the sky. Mailin sat rigid on the buckboard seat of the weathered wagon, her spine as unyielding as the mountains she had spent weeks traversing. Her hands were folded tightly in her lap, knuckles white, a desperate effort to hide the tremors that threatened to betray her terror. She wore a dress of plain, coarse blue cotton, a stark, insulting departure from the heavy silks and intricate jade embroidery she had known in her former life. But it was not the scratchy fabric that chafed her skin. It was the weight of the stairs. They bore into her from every shaded porch and every grime-streaked window. She had traveled across an ocean of salt and then halfway across a savage continent of stone, sold on a promise of stability that now looked like a cruel, dusty joke. Beside her sat the man she was now bound to, a man named Cole. He was a silent, monolithic figure, his hat pulled so low that his eyes remained permanently cast in shadow. He seemed to absorb everything while revealing nothing. His clothes were worn thin, stained with the pervasive red dust of the territory, and the wagon they rode in creaked with the pathetic rhythmic groan of rotting wood. To anyone watching, and indeed to Mailin herself, he looked like a destitute drifter, a man scraping the bottom of the barrel in a land that delighted in devouring the weak. As the wagon rattled past the local saloon, the distinct, jagged sound of laughter erupted from the shadows of the overhang. A group of men leaning idly against the railing with the casual arrogance of predators pointed openly at the mismatched pair. One spat a stream of tobacco juice into the dirt, narrowly missing the wagon's rotating wheel. Mailin kept her eyes fixed forward, refusing to give them the satisfaction of her fear, but she saw Cole's jaw tighten, a subtle, lethal ripple of muscle that vanished as quickly as it appeared. He did not turn his head. He did not acknowledge the jeers or the whispered slurs that floated on the hot wind. He simply flicked the reins, his hands rough and scarred, guiding the tired horses with a strange, gentle precision that contradicted his rugged, broken appearance. "Keep your eyes up," Cole murmured. His voice was a low, gravelly rumble that barely rose above the sound of the wheels grinding against the grit. "They smell fear like blood in the water. Don't give it to them." It was the most he had spoken in 3 hours. Mailin glanced at him, searching his profile for some sign of reassurance, but his face was carved from granite, seemingly indifferent to the humiliation of their arrival. She felt a cold pit of despair open in her stomach. Back in San Francisco, she had expected a hard life, yes, but she had expected a husband with a functioning farm, perhaps a modest plot of land where corn or wheat struggled toward the sun. Instead, she was attached to a man who seemed to own nothing but the dust on his boots and a wagon that threatened to collapse with every revolution of its wheels. The town of Black Ridge faded behind them into a haze of heat and malice. Yet the feeling of being watched, of being hunted, clung to her skin like the grit of the road. The journey out of town took them through a landscape that was both majestic and desolate, a sprawling expanse of scrub brush and jagged rock formations that seemed to stretch into eternity. The spring wildflowers were in bloom, bursting with violent purples and defiant yellows against the red earth. But Mailin could find no beauty in them, only the vast emptiness of her future. They traveled for hours, the sun climbing to its zenith, and then beginning its slow, bruising descent, casting long, distorted shadows across the trail. Cole remained a statue of silence, his eyes constantly scanning the ridgelines, his posture relaxed yet alert, like a wolf feigning sleep. It was late afternoon when he finally slowed the horses, turning the wagon off the main trail onto a path so faint it was barely a suggestion in the dirt. The wagon lurched violently as they began to ascend a steep, rocky incline. Mailin had to grab the edge of the bench to steady herself, her heart pounding a frantic rhythm against her ribs. "Where are we going?" she asked, her voice sounding thin and fragile in the dry air. "Home," Cole replied. The word landed with a heaviness she couldn't interpret, not quite a promise, but not a lie either. They crested the ridge, and the property finally came into view. Maylin's breath hitched, but not from awe. It was a ruin. A small, leaning shack sat isolated in a patch of dry dirt, surrounded by a broken fence that wouldn't have kept out a stray dog, let alone a mountain lion. The roof was patched with mismatched timber, and the windows were dark, gaping holes that stared back at her like the hollow eyes of a skull. This was it. This was the life her family's debt had bought her. A sob caught in her throat, sharp and painful, but she swallowed it down with a fierce, bitter pride. She was a survivor. She had survived the crossing of the Pacific and the auction blocks of the coast. She would survive this desolate patch of dirt, too. Cole brought the wagon to a halt in front of the shack and set the brake. He didn't look at her. He didn't offer an apology for the squalor or a hand to help her down. He simply hopped into the dust, his boots kicking up a dry cloud, and began unhitching the horses. Mailin climbed down slowly, her legs stiff and trembling, and looked around the perimeter. It was quiet, disturbingly so, but as she watched Cole work, she noticed something that didn't fit the narrative of the poor, broken farmer. He moved with an efficiency that was almost military. He checked the cinches and the hooves with a practiced eye, and then, with a casual motion that was too smooth to be accidental, he adjusted the heavy revolver on his hip. It was a pristine weapon, the metal gleaming and well-oiled, a stark, expensive contrast to the poverty of the shack. It was the first breadcrumb of a mystery she was too exhausted to solve. The interior of the shack was as bleak as the exterior promised. A single room, stiflingly hot and thick with dust, containing a cast-iron stove in the corner and a narrow cot pushed against the wall. The air smelled of stale smoke and long-term neglect. Mailin stood in the center of the room, her small travel bag clutched in her hand, feeling the walls closing in on her. Cole entered behind her, carrying a crate of meager supplies. He set it down on a warped wooden table without a word. "It's not much," he said. For the first time she detected a note of something else in his voice, not shame exactly, but a guarded, almost testing quality. "It's a roof," she replied, her voice steady, refusing to let him see the crushing weight of her disappointment. She set her bag down and immediately began to survey the room for what could be done. She would not weep. She would work. Cole watched her for a long moment, his dark eyes tracking her movements as she rolled up her sleeves. He seemed to be measuring her, calculating her resilience against some invisible, high standard. "There's water in the barrel out back," he said, turning toward the door. "I have to check the perimeter before dark." Mailin paused. Perimeter? The word felt too tactical, too heavy for a man living in a shack in the middle of nowhere. "Coyotes," he said shortly. But the way his hand hovered instinctively near his holster suggested he was worried about two-legged predators, not four. He stepped out into the dying light, leaving her alone in the gloom. As she began to sweep the floor with a makeshift broom she found in the corner, her mind raced. The poverty was real enough. The dirt, the lack of furniture, the meager food, but the man didn't fit the setting. He didn't walk like a beaten man. He walked like a man who owned the ground beneath his feet, even if that ground appeared to be worthless. She found a loose floorboard near the stove and pried it up, hoping to find a cellar or some storage, but found only packed earth. However, in the dirt, something glinted. She reached down and pulled out a shell casing. It wasn't old and rusted. It was fresh brass, the smell of cordite still faintly clinging to it. She turned it over in her fingers, the metal cool against her skin. Why would a poor farmer need to expend expensive ammunition in his own home? The sound of Cole's boots on the porch made her shove the casing into her pocket, her heart racing with a sudden, undefined suspicion. 2 days later, the reality of their situation became violently clear during a necessary trip back to Black Ridge for supplies. The initial silence of the town had curdled into active hostility. As Cole tied the horses to the rail outside the general store, a group of riders drifted down the main street, their horses kicking up lazy, ominous clouds of dust. At the center of the group was a man who radiated the kind of power that comes from unchecked wealth and a complete lack of conscience. Harrion. He wore a suit that likely cost more than Cole's entire wagon, and his smile was a cruel slash of white in a tanned, leathery face. He pulled his horse up alongside them, intentionally blocking their path to the store entrance. Mailin instinctively stepped closer to Cole, feeling the sudden, sharp drop in temperature despite the midday sun. "Well now," Harrion drawled, his voice carrying clearly to the gathered onlookers who had stopped to watch the spectacle. "If it isn't the squatter and his new purchase. I heard you went and got yourself a bride, Cole. Didn't think you had 2 nickels to rub together." The men around Harrion chuckled a low, menacing sound that made the hair on the back of Mailin's neck stand up. Cole didn't flinch. He continued to adjust the strap on his saddlebag, his back turned to Harrion. A display of disrespect so profound it seemed to suck the very air out of the street. "We're just here for flour and nails, Harrion," Cole said, his voice flat and bored. "Let us pass." Harrion's smile faltered, replaced by a flash of genuine, jagged anger. He leaned down from his saddle, his shadow falling over Mailin. "You're sitting on my land, boy. That scrap of dirt you're clinging to, it's going to be mine one way or another." He looked at Mailin then, his eyes raking over her with a disgusting, oily familiarity. "Shame to see a pretty thing like this starve to death out there when I finally burn you out." Cole turned then. The movement was slow, deliberate, and utterly terrifying. He looked up at Harrion, and for a second the mask of the poor farmer slipped. Something lethal and ancient looked out from Cole's eyes. It was a look of such intense, concentrated violence that Harrion's horse shied away, sensing the threat, even if its rider was too arrogant to see it fully. "You can try," Cole said softly. The words were a promise, not a boast. "But bring more men." The tension in the air was brittle, ready to snap like dry timber. Harrion's hand twitched toward his gun, but he hesitated. There was something in Cole's stillness, a coiled, serpentine readiness that whispered of a trap. With a sneer and a sharp yank of the reins, Harrion wheeled his horse around. "Enjoy the honeymoon," he spat over his shoulder. "It'll be short." The days that followed the confrontation in town were a masterclass in psychological warfare. Harrion's threat hung over the property like the heavy ozone-scented air before a catastrophic storm. Yet, inside the leaning shack, Mailin found herself witness to a transformation that defied every outward sign of their poverty. Life in the ruin was a trial of grit. The wind whistled through the gaps in the timber, and the dust was a constant, invasive tenant that required endless sweeping. But Cole remained unshakable. He spent his hours mending the pathetic fence, not with the air of a man trying to keep cattle in, but with the meticulousness of a soldier setting a tripwire. He moved with a predatory grace, his eyes never leaving the ridgeline for more than a few seconds. Mailin, for her part, refused to be a spectator to their demise. She cooked meager meals over the temperamental iron stove, her movements growing more certain as she shed the ghost of her pampered past. She stopped looking at her blistered hands and started looking at the horizon. The brass shell casing remained in her pocket, a cold weight that reminded her that the man she had married was a man of secrets, and secrets were the only currency that mattered in a land this lawless. The pressure from the town intensified. Supply wagons that were supposed to pass by their trail lost wheels miles away. The local well dealer suddenly found himself out of stock when Cole rode in. It was a slow strangulation, designed to make them crawl to Harrian for mercy. But as the sun dipped below the peaks on the third night, the atmosphere shifted from harassment to cold-blooded intent. The attack didn't come with a roar or a gallop of hooves. It began with the smell. Mailin woke to the sensation of a rough hand clamped firmly over her mouth. Her eyes snapped open in the pitch black, her heart surging against her ribs like a trapped bird. Cole's face was inches from hers, illuminated only by a faint, sickly orange glow leaking through the cracks in the wall. "Don't make a sound," he hissed, his voice a razor-wire whisper. "They're torching the brush. The wind is carrying it straight for the shack." The heat was already rising. Outside, the dry spring grass, parched by weeks of unrelenting sun, was a tinderbox. Harrian's men had circled the property, lighting fires in a wide arc to create a wall of flame that would flush them out toward the road where the riders sat waiting with rifles. Cole wasn't panicking. He was operating. He reached under the narrow cot and pulled out a long-range repeater rifle, checking the action with a metallic clack that sounded like a death knell in the small room. He grabbed a heavy leather satchel and threw it to Mailin. "That's the only thing that matters in this house," he said, nodding toward the bag. "If we lose it, we lose everything. Stay low." He kicked open the back door, and the roar of the fire hit them a physical blow of heat and smoke that scorched the lungs. The front of the property was a literal wall of hell, a vibrant, terrifying crimson that painted the sky. Silhouettes of men on horseback were visible against the flames, their whoops and hollers carrying on the wind like the cries of demons. "They think we'll run for the road," Cole growled, grabbing Mailin's arm. "They think we're trapped. Aren't we?" She coughed, the smoke stinging her eyes until they watered. "We don't run, Mailin," he said, his eyes reflecting the inferno with a terrifying intensity. "We advance." He led her not toward the open plains, but toward the sheer jagged cliff face that rose directly behind the shack, the direction that appeared to offer nothing but a vertical death. They scrambled through the biting scrub, the fire snapping at their heels, the heat so intense that Mailin felt the hair on her arms curl. As they reached the base of the rock, Cole pushed aside a heavy curtain of dead vines to reveal a narrow fissure, a jagged split in the stone that was invisible from more than 10 feet away. It was a hidden trail, a natural staircase cutting sharply upward into the darkness of the mountain. They climbed in desperate, lung-burning silence, the sounds of the shouting men and the crackling timber of the shack fading beneath them. Halfway up the ridge, they reached a natural ledge that overlooked the valley floor. Mailin stopped, her breath coming in ragged gasps, and looked down. Her heart shattered. The shack, their only home, the place where she had scrubbed the floors and tried to build it a future, was fully engulfed. The dry wood vanished in seconds, the roof collapsing in a shower of sparks. "It's gone," she whispered, the devastation hitting her with the force of a landslide. "Everything we had. It's ash." Cole stood beside her, his silhouette etched against the orange glow of the destruction. He didn't look defeated. He looked vindicated. He looked like a man who had just shed a heavy, suffocating skin. "That wasn't home, Mailin," he said, his voice ringing with a newfound power that made her head whip around. "That was just the camouflage. It was the price I had to pay to keep the world from looking too closely." He turned away from the fire and pointed further up the trail, where the moonlight began to spill over the crest of the ridge. The path opened into a vast, narrow pass. "Harrian thinks he's fighting a beggar for a scrap of dirt," Cole said, taking her hand. His grip was firm, warm, and utterly unshakable. "It's time you saw the real reason he wants me dead. It's time you saw what you really married." They crested the final rise, and for a moment the world simply ceased to exist for Mailin. Below them, nestled in a massive, hidden hanging valley that was invisible from the desert floor, lay a sprawling emerald paradise. It wasn't a farm. It was a fortress of life. Silver streams of water, diverted from the high snow-capped peaks, fed acres of lush, deep green pasture. Hundreds of cattle, sleek, heavy, and healthy, grazed in the moonlight, their coats shimmering like velvet. These weren't the starving beasts of the territory. They were a fortune on four legs. In the center of the valley sat a massive main house, built of sturdy mountain stone and hand-hewn timber, its many windows glowing with the warm, inviting light of lanterns. Outbuildings, barns, and bunkhouses surrounded it in a disciplined circle. It was an entire self-sustaining empire protected by the natural impenetrable fortress of the canyon walls. You own this?" Mailin stammered, her mind reeling as she tried to reconcile the man in the dusty rags with the king of this hidden kingdom. "My father found the water," Cole said quietly, his eyes scanning his domain. "I built the walls. Harrion suspects there's a spring up here, but he has no idea of the scale. He thinks if he kills the squatter at the bottom of the hill, the mountain will just fall into his lap." He turned to her then, the poor farmer mask gone forever. The moonlight caught the hard, noble lines of his face, the face of a man who had built a world out of nothing and was prepared to kill to keep it. "He's about to find out he's not at war with a squatter," Cole said, the metal of his rifle glinting. "He's at war with the man who controls the lifeblood of this territory. And you, Mailin." He stepped closer, his voice dropping to a low, intimate rumble. "You are no longer a bride of the dust. You are the lady of this valley. Welcome home." The descent into the hidden valley was a journey through a veil between worlds. Behind them lay the scorched skeletal remains of the decoy shack and the bitter memory of the desert floor. Before them was an oasis that smelled of damp earth, crushed sage, and the sweet, heavy scent of blooming clover. As the horses navigated the steep, rocky switchbacks, the cool air rising from the valley floor brushed against Mailin's face, washing away the phantom heat of the fire that had consumed their former life. They rode past herds of cattle that watched their passage with lazy indifference. These were not the rib-thin beasts seen in the town markets. They were massive, sleek animals, their coats heavy with fat and health, a walking fortune in a territory where men killed for a single side of beef. But it was the house that held Mailin's gaze. As they drew closer, the sheer scale of it became undeniable. It was a fortress of hand-hewn timber and native stone, built to endure for centuries. Wide, deep porches wrapped around the lower level, and massive chimneys puffed gentle, welcoming plumes of smoke into the star-punctured sky. As they reached the yard, men appeared from the shadows of the barns and outbuildings. These were not the jagged, desperate drifters Mailin had seen in Black Ridge. They were clean-shaven, well-armed, and moved with the disciplined focus of veterans. They nodded to Cole with the easy, quiet respect of soldiers, greeting a commander they would follow into hell. Two men stepped forward to take the horse's reins without a word, their eyes flickering briefly to Mailin with curiosity, but notably devoid of the malice she had grown to expect. Cole guided her up the stone steps to the heavy oak double doors, his hand resting protectively on the small of her back. The heat of the fire was still a phantom sensation on her skin, but here, in the vast shadow of the mountain, safety felt like a physical weight settling over her shoulders. Inside, the house was a revelation of hidden power and unexpected comfort. The floors were polished hardwood, partially covered by thick woven rugs that muffled their footsteps. The walls were not bare timber, but were lined with shelves of leather-bound books and hand-drawn maps of the territory. A fire crackled in a massive stone hearth, casting a rich golden glow over deep leather armchairs and a mahogany dining table set with silver that gleamed like fallen stars in the firelight. Cole closed the door behind them, the heavy muffled thud shutting out the rest of the world. He turned to her, removing his sweat-stained hat and tossing it onto a side table. His face, usually a mask of stoic peasant indifference, finally relaxed. "I'm sorry for the deception," he said, his voice low and echoing in the high-ceilinged room. He walked to a porcelain basin near the entrance, dipped a linen cloth, and wrung it out. He approached her slowly, the gesture intimate and entirely unguarded. But out there, wealth is nothing but a target. I needed to know who you were, what you were made of before I brought you inside these walls. He gently wiped a smudge of soot from her cheek, his knuckles grazing her skin with a tenderness that made her breath catch. Mailin stood frozen, her heart hammering not from the terror of the fire, but from the sudden, overwhelming proximity of this stranger who was her husband. "And who am I?" she whispered, looking up into his dark, searching eyes. Cole paused, his hand lingering on her face. "You're the woman who didn't run," he said softly. "You stood in the dirt and fought for a ruin because you thought it was all we had. That makes you worthy of the kingdom." The next morning broke with a serenity that felt almost suspicious after the chaos of the night. Mailin woke in a bed buried under down quilts, the sunlight streaming through real glass windows, not oiled paper or shutters, illuminating a room that smelled of lavender and cedar. On a chair by the bed, she found clothes laid out for her: riding leathers, a crisp linen shirt, and sturdy, well-made boots. Practical gear that spoke of action rather than ornamentation. When she descended the stairs, she found Cole in what looked like a war room. A massive map of the territory was spread across a heavy table, weighted down by ammunition boxes and a brass compass. He looked up as she entered, and for a fleeting moment the strategist vanished, replaced by a man simply admiring his wife. "Coffee," he said, pushing a steaming porcelain cup toward her. "Black and strong. We have work to do." Min took the cup, walking to the table to study the map. She traced the lines of the canyon, seeing the choke points and the hidden water sources marked in red ink. "Harrion controls the town," she observed, her finger resting on the cluster of buildings called Black Ridge. "But you control the lifeblood of the land." "He controls the road," Cole corrected, moving to stand beside her, his shoulder brushing hers. "He squeezes the supply lines. He thinks he can starve the valley out by blocking the trade routes. That's why I posed as a poor farmer to slip into town, gather intelligence, and move small supplies without drawing his main force. He thinks he won last night. He thinks he burned out a squatter." He pointed to the spot where their shack had once stood. "By noon, his scouts will find the tracks leading into the rocks. By sundown, he'll realize the squatter didn't die. He vanished. And then he'll come looking for the gate." The tension in the room spiked, but it was a shared tension now, a partnership forged in the anticipation of violence. Mailin looked at the map, her mind working with a sharp, tactical clarity she hadn't known she possessed. "If he comes up the trail we used," she said, tracing the narrow, winding switchbacks, "he'll be in single file, exposed." Cole nodded, a slow, genuine smile spreading across his face, a smile that softened the hard, lethal lines of his jaw. "Exactly. It's not a path, it's a kill box." He turned to her, his expression intensifying. "I have men to hold the main line, Mailin, but I need someone watching the back gate the goat passed to the north. It's a steep climb, and Harrion is arrogant, but he isn't stupid. He might try to flank us." He reached out, taking her hand and pressing a heavy brass spyglass into her palm. "I trust no one else with my blind spot. If you see dust in the north, you signal the house. Can you do that?" "I didn't come this far to watch you lose," she replied, her voice as hard as the mountain stone. The preparation for the assault was a blur of controlled, professional chaos. The ranch hands transformed into a disciplined militia, positioning rifles behind reinforced rock walls and checking sight lines. Cole moved among them, issuing orders with quiet authority, but his eyes constantly returned to the ridge where Mailin stood watch. She had ridden to the northern ridge, a high, lonely vantage point that offered a dizzying view of the treacherous path winding down the back of the mountain. It was silent up there, the wind whipping her hair across her face, but she felt a strange, cold calm. She was no longer the vulnerable bride on a rickety wagon. She was the sentinel of the valley. Through the spyglass she scanned the horizon, her thoughts drifting to the man below. Their marriage wasn't built on poetry or courtly gestures. It was being built on this terrified, exhilarating trust. When she rode back down at midday to report, Cole met her at the stables. He lifted her down from the saddle, his hands gripping her waist firmly, holding her a second longer than necessary. "Clear?" he asked. "Clear for now," she replied, "but the wind is shifting. There's dust rising in the east, far beyond the main trail." Cole pulled her closer, the adrenaline of the looming fight acting as a catalyst. He kissed her then, hard, desperate, and possessive. It was a claiming that had nothing to do with ownership and everything to do with shared survival. "Stay close to the house when it starts," he murmured against her hair. "I can't fight him if I'm looking for you." The attack didn't come as a stealthy raid. It came as a siege. Just as the sun began to dip behind the peaks, painting the sky in violent shades of bruised purple, the first crack of a rifle echoed off the canyon walls, shattering the peace of the valley. Harrion had brought an army. From the veranda, Mailin watched as puffs of smoke bloomed on the distant ridge. Cole was out there, a dark silhouette on the ramparts, his rifle speaking in rhythmic, thumping retorts. The valley, designed as a trap, was working perfectly. Harrion's men were bottled up in the narrow pass, unable to advance against the withering fire from Cole's entrenched positions. But then, panic flared in Mailin's chest. Through the spyglass, she saw a second, smaller column of dust. It wasn't coming from the east, it was coming from the north, her sector. Harrion wasn't just a brute, he was a tactician. He had sent a hand-picked flanking force to scale the impossible northern cliffs. She didn't run for the safety of the cellar. She ran for the warning bell mounted near the kitchen, a massive iron triangle. She grabbed the striker and hammered it with every ounce of her strength. 3 sharp, dissonant clangs cut through the roar of the gunfire. Cole heard the signal. He spun around, seeing Mailin pointing frantically towards the northern ridge. He didn't hesitate. Signaling his lieutenant to hold the main gate, he sprinted toward the horses, vaulting into the saddle of his black stallion. He rode not away from the fight, but toward the breach, yelling for Mailin to get inside. But she didn't. She grabbed the Winchester repeater Cole had left on the porch, a weapon he had shown her how to load only hours before, and leveled it on the railing. As the first of Harrion's flankers crested the northern ridge, expecting an undefended rear, they were met not with silence, but with the sharp, defiant crack of Mailin's rifle. Her shot went wide, kicking up dirt and rock, but it stalled them. It bought the precious seconds Cole needed. He thundered up the slope, firing from the saddle, a demon of dust and fury. The flankers, caught between a woman who refused to yield and a man who rode like the apocalypse, broke. They scrambled back down the scree, their surprise attack dissolving into a rout. The silence that followed the battle was heavier than the gunfire. The sun had set, leaving the valley bathed in a deep spectral blue. Harrion's forces, broken on the rocks of the main pass and repelled at the flank, had retreated into the darkness, leaving their pride in the dust. Cole rode back to the main house, his horse frothed with sweat, his shirt stained with dirt and gunpowder. He slid from the saddle and walked up the steps, his chest heaving. Mailin was still standing by the railing, the rifle clutched in her white-knuckled hands. She was trembling now, the adrenaline crash hitting her all at once. Cole didn't say a word. He walked straight to her, took the rifle gently from her hands, and set it against the wall. Then he swept her into his arms, burying his face in the crook of her neck. They stood there for a long time, the smell of cordite and sweat mingling with the scent of night-blooming jasmine. "You held the line," he whispered, his voice thick with an emotion he could no longer hide. "You saved us." Mailin pulled back to look at him, seeing the exhaustion, the relief, and the raw adoration in his eyes. "We saved us," she corrected. The silence that followed the battle was heavier than the gunfire had ever been. The sun had long since surrendered, leaving the valley bathed in a bruised, spectral purple twilight that made the jagged peaks look like the teeth of a sleeping giant. Harian's forces, broken on the natural ramparts of the main pass and repelled by the unexpected defiance at the northern flank, had retreated into the darkness, leaving behind nothing but the smell of spent gunpowder and their shattered pride. Cole rode back to the main house, his horse frothed with white sweat and shivering from the exertion. He was a vision of controlled fury, his shirt stained with grease and dirt, his face streaked with soot, yet his eyes remained fixed on the porch. He slid from the saddle before the horse had even come to a full stop and walked up the stone steps, his chest heaving. Mailin was still standing by the railing, the Winchester clutched in her white-knuckled hands as if it were the only thing keeping her tethered to the earth. She was trembling now, a violent rhythmic shaking as the adrenaline crash finally hit her. Cole didn't say a word. He walked straight to her, his large calloused hands gently prizing the rifle from her grip. He set it against the stone wall and, in one fluid motion, swept her into his arms. He buried his face in the crook of her neck, and for the first time she felt the frantic beat of his heart against her own. They stood there for a long time, the scent of cordite and sweat mingling with the perfume of the night-blooming jasmine that climbed the porch pillars. "You held the line," he whispered, his voice thick with a raw emotion he had spent years trying to bury. "You saved us, Mailin. You saved the kingdom." She pulled back just enough to look at him, seeing the exhaustion and the profound adoration in his eyes. The mask of the stoic, destitute farmer was gone, and in its place was a man who looked at her as if she were the most precious thing he had ever owned. "We saved us," she corrected, her voice regaining its strength. The next day, the dynamic of the territory had shifted irrevocably. The air felt cleaner. The threat that had stifled the land for years seemingly evaporated with the morning mist. Cole and Mailin did not skulk back to their lives. They rode into Black Ridge not in a rotting wagon, but on thoroughbred horses, flanked by 6 of their most trusted outriders. The town was silent as they entered, but it was a different kind of silence than the one they had encountered before. It was the silence of awe, of a community witnessing the birth of a new era. The people peered from behind curtains and stood on the boardwalks, their eyes wide as they realized the poor farmer was the sovereign of the very mountain they feared. Harian stood on the porch of the marshal's office, nursing a heavily bandaged arm, his face a twisted mask of bitter, impotent defeat. His power had been broken not just by bullets, but by the realization that he had picked a fight with a force he couldn't comprehend. A man who had the patience to play the beggar, and a woman who had the heart to be a queen. Cole brought his horse to a halt in the center of the street, at the exact spot where they had been humiliated days prior. He looked at Harian, then at the townspeople, his voice carrying to every corner of the thoroughfare with the resonance of a tolling bell. "The valley is no longer a secret," Cole announced, his interlaced fingers holding Mailin's hand for all to see. "But it is still mine. Anyone who wants honest work and a fair wage can come to the gate, but anyone who brings war will be buried at it." He looked at Mailin then, and the fierce protective fire in his eyes softened into something deep and permanent. It was the final seal on their victory, a public declaration that the immigrant bride and the man of the mountain were the true power of the frontier. As they turned their horses back toward the mountains, toward the hidden paradise that was now theirs to rule together, Mailin squeezed his hand. She had come west expecting to merely survive a master, to endure a life of toil and dust. Instead, she had found a partner, a sanctuary, and a legacy. The dust swirled behind them, settling over the town of Black Ridge, but ahead of them, The peaks were clear, and the path to the hidden valley was wide open. They rode toward the horizon, two souls forged in the fire of the frontier, heading home to the empire they had built out of nothing but grit, secrets, and a love that was as unyielding as the stone itself.